And so we're off. Welcome everyone to the latest Q community update. We're going to go through our usual sort of agenda here, talking about release updates and the evaluator, which is closely linked to the recent releases. A section about deployment patterns and defaults with a call to action there. A regular slot of talking about the encodings that Q supports and changes there. Modules in the central registry, updates on the LSP, as well as updates to docs and content on qlang.org and q.dev, and then just sort of finishing up with a brief community updates and any Q&A at the end. Daniel, I'll hand straight over to you.
Yep. So in terms of releases, the last time we spoke, we were doing pre-releases for Zero 13. That release is now out. It's been out for a couple of weeks now. We'll talk about the evaluator changes shortly, so I'm not going to go into those. And we also covered many of these changes in the last community call. So I'm also not going to go into any of the details, but the changelog is huge. So I would suggest that you go look at it and think about updating if you haven't yet. And the idea is we will most likely do a backporting release in the next week or so, because we have had some bug fixes already. And then we're going to get the ball rolling for 0.14 alphas soon as well. And a reminder, if anybody's stuck on old versions, please let me know why. I suspect that some of you may run into evaluator issues with the switch to Eval v3 by default. If that is the case, you can still turn it off, but please also let us know, either me directly or raising a bug report on GitHub, whichever way you prefer. But please let us know if you're blocked on an older release.
Marcel. You're muted.
Yes, muted. Evaluator. So as Daniel already said, v13 has been released, which includes making Eval v3 the default. So as we promised in later community calls, we said that we would need to do some performance improvements in order to release it. In the end, we did not do it because the performance improvements for most people was enough. This is mostly due to the new closeness algorithm. But that means that there's still a lot to gain. So whereas with the old evaluator, basically there was memory management, but not for the closeness algorithm. So that was relatively still slow, but so that, with the memory management, this was quite large. So now with the new evaluator, the memory management for the normal evaluator blew up, but now the closeness algorithm is much closer. So if we then also do memory management for the evaluator, you can expect to have a significant performance improvement. So that's what we're still looking at. We also have some performance issues with the new closeness algorithm, which I'm working on right now. So it might become even faster. It's affecting only some people. So there's many bug fixes. We're still uncovering more Eval v2 bugs as finalizing some other things. But yeah, overall, the number of bugs in Eval v3 is considerably lower than Eval v2, what we noticed. So far, we had a few reports of regressions, but remarkably few, actually. So thanks everybody for filing bugs again. That's always very helpful and trying out a new evaluator. Then yeah, since last time, we still have one issue left, which you haven't addressed, but that didn't change. There is now only one high priority semantics bug open, which I mostly have fixed, but it uncovers some other problems. These are the Eval v2 problems that I was talking about, and some older issues that are still available, still there in both. Then we have two performance issues open, which we, as soon as that bug is out, we aim to fix. So one of which is the memory management, the other one is the closeness bug, and that still leaves us open the fine-grained structure sharing as a possible optimization, which also has not been done yet. So then towards 1.0, so like final version of the language, a little bit longer term. But the next step, I made a proposal a little while back to not turn validators into ground values. This has a lot of good properties to not do that. It didn't affect Unity at all. I ran the test, but it's been ready for a while now, but we didn't want to commingle this with an Eval v3 release. So this is planned for Eval v14, but this is still something that needs to be done or submitted. So another thing that we want to do soon is so now that we have released eval v2 also, I think the title might be, this is in the wrong slide, but I'll mention it anyway. It's the expert-specific disjunct elimination. So with the new closeness algorithm, closeness is a little bit less predictable. Sorry. And with the export, so basically what we now want to do is if you export a value and you have, for example, an unsatisfied required field, or if you have different optional fields, that should be considered one value, right? So eliminating disjunctions in those cases. So that's something that needs to be done. Another thing that we want to do is the unary equals, but the first inquiry, not one. Yeah, so right now, if you have this these two validators, so greater equals to 1 and less than equals to 1, it simplifies it to 1, but 1 is a concrete value and the validators are not. And this is confusing to some people. We cannot always guarantee it, so it provides for inconsistencies. So it's not great. So error messages and friends, this is something we want to do for, like sooner rather than later. So another thing is, Paul will talk about it later, defaults and aliases. We want to change a bit how that work. The use of discriminator fields and a try proposal, which I've written and hope to publish soon, which is also some quite handy language feature. So for the next steps for the evaluator itself, so taking it a step back, there's this one remaining bug 3920. It's a field not allowed aggression. We really need to fix that. So that's the one Unity bug that's remaining. So it's mostly done. And also what we've noticed is that this might take more eval v2 fixing it, but these are all bugs in eval v2. So like really quite serious bugs in eval v2 that we can't really work around. So the other thing, performance-wise, as I said, memory management, fine-grained structure sharing, closeness algorithm, but also discriminator fields. Rush has done some work on detecting discriminator fields, and we can use that to pre-eliminate disjunctions. So I'll add this warning on the slide multiple times. It's not an accident. So we plan to remove eval v2 in v015. So just as a heads up. So if you keep relying on eval v2, at some point it will disappear. So towards 0.14 specifically. So before I mentioned next steps within 0.13. But one of them is what I mentioned earlier, the manifestation of bounds. So the error messages we really want to do now. We also want to take so this is custom error messages. And some other reflection built-ins. I think it was 843, the issue. So improved error messages, especially when we start removing 0 or eval v2, it will be easier to do, but even before that with the discriminator field support, we can start looking at improving error messages. So another thing that's really important is the disambiguation on export, because so with the new closeness, the new philosophy of closeness, that doesn't, the way it works right now, doesn't jive fully with it anymore. It already didn't in the eval v2 anyway, but I think at least from a philosophical point, it's important to accelerate this now, and this will be a strict improvement, I would think. I don't expect there to be incompatibilities. So the unary equal support might be a bit early for v014, but we could consider it. So another thing, the whole closeness algorithm was designed around a different concept of closeness, and we're looking at just simplifying closeness altogether, making it much more explicit, to not assign specific meaning to the embedding position of references, but having basically, if you have a reference and it's added with a ... It basically means don't check closeness, and without, it's always checked regardless of whether it's an embedding position or not. But that's a big transition phase, so it will be tricky to manage, but it should be possible. Then aliases and defaults. So aliases is another proposal you might expect. So in the spec, there's now 7 different types of aliases. and they look all the same, but they're all different, and it's quite confusing to users. So we have an idea to replace this with one, and we can do this, which I think will make things a lot simpler. So, and then finally, I want to remind people to use Unity. We've heavily relied on this for Eval v3. We picked Unity projects for finding performance improvements, and those were typically the first one we tackled. It's also easy for us to check if we had success, and also with regressions. Before we submit something, we'll catch the problems with in Unity, right? Some cases we choose to not to still put a regression in Unity. But this is quite rare. We usually always make sure that Unity keeps passing. And then even if you very quickly report it to us, right, like it's then out of sight, out of mind, right? So it can take like another cycle before we get to fixing the bugs, whereas with Unity, the feedback is very, very direct. So a lot of benefits for you to use it. So here's the link. And I think that concludes my slides.
Thank you very much. Yeah, just to reiterate, huge thanks to those who have added projects to Unity recently. It massively improved our ability to not only accelerate changes to Eval v3 bug fixes, but also to understand the impact of various changes, whatever they might be. And that is, again, just tightening that loop on us being able to make changes quicker, and even proposals as well. So thank you. So now just talking a bit about deployment patterns and defaults. And here, what I'm talking about is defaults at the language level of Q, so default values as they're referred to. Just a quick state of the nation on the kinds of scenarios that we're all dealing with on a daily basis. Some combination of the following, whether it be multiple configurations involving multiple environments, regions, whatever they might be, schema definitions for our config inputs and outputs, coordination between teams, policy enforcement, whatever it might be, multiple config sources. This is what we're dealing with, and this is actually one of the benefits that we have from Q, is actually introducing some sort of description or declaration of how these things combine together and how they unify and what the inputs are and what the outputs are. But there are still a number of open questions with all of that. Q at the language level is sort of at the base of all of this. And then we have things like tooling and modules, et cetera, that builds on top of that. And so what we're trying to establish is, well, what are the right building blocks? What are the right primitives for achieving all of these things? Because we're not going to solve everything at the language level. Some things will be solved in the language. Some other things will be solved in tooling. Other things like version control or coordination is solved by modules. And so not everything has its solution in the language. And with this in mind, what we're really looking to do is just express a few questions here, the number of open questions. How should these deployment patterns, and not to be restrictive in that term either, but how should we declare and structure these sorts of complex environments? How best to represent the collaboration between teams and all of this? Now comes sort of quite a language specific thing. What's the right role for default values in all of this? Default values at the language level. Are they good enough right now? Do we need to rethink or extend them in some way? Do we need to sort of think about a concept that's at sort of like some other slightly higher level when we're answering some of these questions? i.e., we don't have to solve everything at a language level. We can, as I said, solve different problems at different levels here. How do we reason about constraints between different components in any such system? So there are a large number of these that sort of have either direct answers or hints at answers in Q the language itself, or indeed Q the language plus some tooling or modules. But it's all about now sort of trying to tie these things together, particularly when there are a number of users out there who have very/extremely large Q configurations. How actually do we start to sort of establish, embody, and fully support best practices in all of these areas here? So this is really a call to action. What we're really asking for here is, especially for those people who have some experience of Q, and I don't want to limit it to at scale, it's just some experience with Q. It could be very little experience with Q, relatively speaking, as in you tried defaults, and they just didn't work for you. That's absolutely fine. Or to the other extreme, where you have 40 teams and X number of people per team, they're all working with Q, and you're having to sort of coordinate between them. What is your experience in this space? What patterns are working well for you? What, as we say here, is messy, manual, or brittle? Where's this friction? Let us know. Is Q getting in your way when really it shouldn't be? It should be there as a tool to sort of support all of this stuff going forward. And then sort of slightly more abstractly, how are you managing the sort of the very real human aspect to this? Coordination between teams, who can see what, etc. How do you want to see defaults / layering, whatever layering might mean to you? Do you use a different term? Just all of this is, as you can see, intrinsically linked to changes within the language when it comes to things like defaults, but also potentially other layers that build very closely on top of this. So this is a call to action and a request. We have already started back in February, I think it was, discussion in this space here, and a big thank you to Joshua Gilman, Tom Van Dinther, Prasanth, and a number of others who joined that call to really just sort of kickstart this conversation. It was a very loose, open discussion at the time. But now that we've gotten to a point where eval v3 is getting, well, it's already on by default in the latest version, right? So we're sort of creating space, as Marcel suggested, to be able to work on these language changes, but also to tackle these slightly larger pieces that build on top of what are just purely language constructs to actually solve real world problems, bluntly, with more than just language changes. So this is what we're trying to tackle. So please join us in the deployment patterns channel on Slack. There's also a repo which is not really being used at the moment, but it's intended to be very open for issues, PRs, whatever, for people to just share ideas on how they think about things, what they're doing in this space. And I'm looking to help sort of kickstart or restart engagement with that. But feel free to just message on Slack as well, or Discord, raise an issue in the main Q repo, or if there's anything sort of slightly non-public that you want to discuss, because often in these situations, when it comes to configuration, that is the case, please feel free to just get in touch directly as well. So that's a call to action on deployment patterns and defaults and sort of anything related. So please get in touch on that. Encodings, Daniel, can I hand back to you on that one?
Yep, so this will be another brief recap, because the last time we did a community call, there was a new experimental XML encoding that was available in an alpha release. So that has shipped now in 0.13, which is a stable release. The encoding is still experimental, but you can play with it. And there's an example right there, and you can follow the discussion for more details. We plan to transition this encoding to be stable at some point, but for now it's still experimental. And just to reiterate that this is one XML encoding for Q, but this is not the default encoding. That's why it's XML plus Koala. And as a very brief recap, that's because XML doesn't map to JSON or Q cleanly, right? Because of attributes and so on, and namespaces. So this is one way to deal with XML data in Q, experimental for now.
Awesome, thank you very much. I think we're now on, where are we? Modules of the central registry. Rog?
Yes, so I'll go over some of these points will be familiar, but just for those who haven't been to one of these meetings before, a reminder of what the central registry is. So it's a central service on the internet for hosting some schemas. They not necessarily well known and not necessarily well known services, but particularly its well known place. And many well-known schemas and well-known services, schemas for well-known services will be there. It's the namespace is like Q modules are. It's domain name based, but those domain names signify where it comes from, not necessarily what the source is of the particular data there. And at the moment, well, actually, that point is now out of date, because we do allow, as I will point out in a subsequent slide, non-github.com rooted modules for now. I'll go into that in a little bit. But all the authorization and authentication is GitHub based still, but that will change. Yeah, it's all Semver based, similar to Go's module versioning, and you can support publishing. You can publish your own modules, and you can derive some modules from elsewhere and publish those too, if you like. Now, oh, I can actually. The arrow thing does work. Good. Yeah, big news. If you want to publish your own modules under your own namespace, you can actually do that right now. We are doing that. The way to do that is if you're in control, if you're serving some content from your particular domain, you can serve something up inside the .wellknown URL, and I'll go into a little bit of detail on that in a moment. And that will map your domain to a GitHub repository that is then used for authorization, for all authorization decisions on that domain, on that module domain. And as I said, we're using that in q.dev. So here's an example. You can, that's all you need. You just need to make that curl command work for your domain. So in this case, we're doing HTTPS fetch of q.dev / and then that particular phrase .wellknown / q central registry.json, and you need to just serve up something that says the only type we support is GitHub, so that type GitHub always has to be there, and then you give the name of your GitHub repository, which is that's what's going to be used for authorization decisions when pushing to or pulling from that particular domain. And for now, there is only one authorization, one repo for anything in that domain. That will probably change in the future, but for now we're starting simple. And then there's a hint to the cache to say how long you want that to be. So we will probably leave. We won't poll it that often, basically. So here 24 hours. And in the future, we will probably support text record support rather than HTTP support, similar to the kind of way that DNS like SSL certificates work with Let's Encrypt or Blue Sky works. So I think that's a fairly standard thing to do. We'll probably do that. We'd like to provide the ability to delegate from one domain to another. There's and more finer grained access control, so you can have maybe several repositories within your domain. But for now, we've kept it simple. Yeah, please try it out, see what you think. And we've got a discussion that will be linked through there, so you can leave any feedback for us. Please do. Another thing that we've done is published one example CRD to the central registry. We want to publish lots more, but we're working on some improvements. So there's an example there. We've just published some Kyverno CRDs, and as of earlier today, we've now that those actually fill in CRDs actually fill in the API version of kind fields, which actually is pretty useful. So you can't get those wrong in your error messages. If you're providing if you're checking a CRD that has the wrong API version field set, then it will tell you directly about that. Again, feedback welcome, and we'd like to know what other CRDs you might like to see in the curated modules, and I've created a discussion for people to send that kind of feedback. Please do. And as far as where we're going next, we want lots more documentation about using the curated schemas and using the central registry generally. We want to provide the ability to import CRDs into Q without, because at the moment it's mostly custom inside the central registry code, and we want to improve in general rendering of documentation for modules that are in the central registry. That would be we're doing a lot of work on that, and search and discovery. And we want the ability to have your GitHub Actions able to just get central registry access automatically, and more authentication options too, not necessarily just GitHub. And if you want other schemas as part of curated modules, please let us know. One thing that I haven't that I haven't mentioned, I don't know why, I think I thought I did, is that we do have another authentication option now. We actually have the option of no authentication at all. So we actually do support anonymous access to the central registry. It's fairly rate limited, but it works. So if you want to do stuff in GitHub Reactions that involves pulling modules, public modules from the central registry, you can just do that now. There's no need to send a token. You can just do that. If you want the rate limits to go away, then of course you'll need to authenticate with a token. But that should be useful, and that means that, for example, open source projects don't necessarily need people to authenticate when pulling them. So I think that's a big improvement. And I think that's the end of my update.
It is. Just to briefly add on that, on the piece on the auth side of things, yes, exactly. So the open source projects, there's at least 2 projects that are relying on the central registry's lack of requiring auth now, i.e. there being public read-only access in their project. So they then just can start using the central registry straight off the bat, their users, without needing to sign up to any sort of service, which is a good thing for the open source project's perspective, but we're going to actually add some docs around this as well. If those projects and their users actually do need auth, the migration from using no auth to actually using any form of auth is trivial for either the Q command or anything that wraps the Go API. This was a key part of the design of the modules proposal being OCI based, that people can and should be able to leverage existing OCI mechanisms, OCI auth mechanisms, with almost zero effort. And so the central registry being just a special case of an OCI repository, that we have GitHub-based auth for now. And as we said, we'll do other auth options. But if someone, say, for example, in whatever enterprise already has an auth setup, those open source tools that can just rely on public read-only access to the central registry can just trivially be pointed at, say, for example, an internal OCI registry, and just work by setting like a config variable. So this transition from no auth required to, oh, I want to use this specific OCI server, is designed to be trivial when it comes to the module side of things. And that was a key part of the modules proposal. So that really sort of supports those open source projects both ways. There's almost zero cost adoption of trying out the central registry, but those same open source projects, their users can flip to point at an internal registry if that's what they actually need to do. So we'll just be providing some more docs around that space. There was something else that I was going to mention off the back of Roger's update, but I've totally forgotten it now. So we can come to that later if I remember it. Otherwise, I'll hand over to Matthew to talk about QLSP.
Cool, thank you. Just in case you don't know, the LSP is the language server protocol, and it's how your modern editors get auto completion and jump to definition and those sorts of functionalities. So I'm working on the QLSP. So the sort of initial minimal set of features that are being targeted are things like automatic formatting on save, jump to definition, error diagnostics, annotations of when you're hovering over stuff in VS Code, that sort of thing. And we'll be testing against VS Code, Emacs, and EOVim, and possibly 1 or 2 other editors as well. Now we're building this by taking the Go LSP implementation and adapting that, and that has pros and cons. It gets us an awful lot of machinery and sort of well-tested and well used framework for relatively low cost. But obviously there's actually quite a lot of code there to learn and understand and tweak. So I've been slowly trying to make the 2 worlds meet together in a sensible way. So currently you can use QLSP, though really all it does is when you open a Q file, the LSP server gets told about it and it will load that module. And that's it. So you get absolutely sort of nothing useful yet. So don't use it. It understands relationships between modules and packages. So, for example, it builds up the dependency graph. It understands when one file in a package changes, and therefore it has to invalidate not only all the cache results within that particular package, but also cache results in any other package which happens to be loaded that imports that original modified package transitively. So a bunch of that machinery is done and seems to be working. It can understand in some cases when some of this cache stuff needs to be invalidated. So in particular, if you're editing a file and you change the package that this file is in, then it will spot that that's happened, and it will try and do some of the recalculations. But really, at the moment, all it's doing is just reloading the packages. It's not actually doing any sort of analysis, and it's certainly not sending any useful information back to the editor at this point. In the last couple of weeks, I've been looking more at in the LSP, we need to be able to cope with a file has changed. We need to be able to very efficiently reload that file, recombine it into existing packages which have already been loaded. And we want to do the least amount of work possible because you're responding to keyboard key presses. Whereas in the Q world, an awful lot of the code around loading packages and modules has been written much more sort of batchy in design, because it's mainly used from the command line where you just want to load everything as quickly as possible, and it doesn't really support the this file has changed, can you just recompute this sort of thing. So yeah, there's quite a lot of low-level plumbing going on to try and make that work a little bit better. So yes, that is the state of play right now. Hopefully by the time we have a next community update call, there'll be something more useful to show.
That's kind. Just the last point there, I think, hints as to, again, where we've been running up against sort of another challenge that is open, as well as to what it means to actually load Q code. And that right now we only have this one loading mechanism that is, in some situations, hopelessly overloaded, if you'll excuse the pun. And that actually we need to piece that apart, provide a config option to not do the Kubernetes style ancestor directory loading, but also then extend to support, and this has been a long-standing request, different ways of loading Q code. So having a single package essentially split across multiple directories potentially. And so basically the work that, well, not basically, that definitely underplays it. The work that Matthew's doing here to relook at the loading mechanism also provides us a means of tackling two birds with one stone, because quite frankly, the LSP will crumble under the weight of loading too much Q if that's actually not what the user intends, and it won't even work for projects where they don't load according to a standard pattern. So we need to support these standard patterns. So at least this refactoring also provides us with a clear opportunity to branch and actually introduce different loading mechanisms as well. So that's a key part of the work. Super, thanks, Matthew. Moving briefly on to the docs and content side of things, and a big thank you to Jonathan Matthews for helping to not only make a number of changes in this space, but also for pulling together this these slides here. We've talked about the upgrade to eval v3 as of 0.13, and so we have a guide that sort of touches on the key things to consider when upgrading to 0.13. We have a TOML guide that is, again, just looking to advertise the ways in which Q can work with different encodings, TOML in this case, and that similarity with YAML and JSON. Rog has pulled together a first cut of a concept piece that looks at how, when using the Go API, your dependencies in your Go project actually change. And this was in response to some great feedback from Eddie Knight and others who contribute to his project, whereby they looked to add the evaluator to their project, and they saw a big diff when it came to the go.sum file. And unfortunately, when you're just seeing a diff at a file level, that doesn't actually tell you very much about what it is that's going on from a dependency story. So Roger's done some really nice and some nice analysis in there with some pretty graphs that help to explain and sort of piece apart, or not piece apart, sort of piece out the bits that are test-only dependencies or whatever they might be. And so that's a really nice explainer that also then gives a visual idea of, okay, what is your actual, for want of a better phrase, security exposure when it comes to adding Q as a dependency? What code are you actually running? And Rog also hints at the bottom of that article. It's something else that we thought about for some time as to how we can best sort of layer dependencies, potentially shifting towards a dependency injection style model where you can truly have minimal dependencies when it comes to whatever you want to do with Q. But that's just a sort of a thought phase right now. That document will hopefully give some actually hints as to what we're actually doing there. And here is that guide from eval v2 to v3. So please go and give that a look, especially if you are in the process of trying out. It's in combination with the release notes. It's designed to sort of it's designed to be a partner to those release notes to sort of highlight the key areas, especially where there might be semantic differences. A number of different how-to guides on qlang.org there. One perhaps favorite that I have amongst that list there, not that I should necessarily have favorites, embedding files is, we're still making heavy use of embedding. Generating Go types from Q definitions, that's something that we are heavily dogfooding ourselves in internal services that we've written. We used to go the other way around. We used to start from Go and go to Q. Too many goes in there, but hopefully that made sense. But now actually we use Q as the source of truth and generate Go, which is a much cleaner approach because it allows us to maintain that logical single source of truth much better. A number of folks have asked questions that basically are saying, well, hey, how do we get dependencies between one OCI server and another? And there's a nice piece there about QMod Mirror that explains, again, that sort of ties into this story of the OCI model behind Q's dependencies. So that's worth a look as well. So yeah, I can't really say that I have favorites because I've listed 3 or 4 there now. On the QDev side of things, as Rog said, we've got the Kyverno guides. He hinted at them being available soon. They are there already, so please give them a try. These are similar to the guides that we have for the other curated modules that we've published. And that had a sort of, each of them is trying to sort of introduce this concept of what the journey with Q is, where you perhaps start with an existing, in this case, Kyverno policy, which is YAML based. How do you actually validate that? And how do you start to move more towards Q as a source of truth, and what benefits you have from doing that along the way? And all these examples use the curated modules that are published to the central registry. And there is that page, a nice little screenshot there. That's it on the doc side of things. Dominic, if you want to take over on the community update.
Yes, a short community update. Oh, can I move to the next slide?
I can for you. Apologies,
Thank you
I'll
very
add you.
So in this period, there was no conference, so no merge updates, but very similar to previous updates. I just want to reiterate how helpful it is to learn about your use cases, challenges, and what you would like to have from Q. For example, the authentication change with the central registry, that was one learning we received by talking to people. And we have a lot of conversations with the users, potential users. We learn a lot, and that helps us a lot in the daily work. So if you have anything you want to discuss, just don't hesitate, let us know. And another thing is logos on qlang.org. We've added a few logos over between the last community call and now. It's extremely helpful. If you use Q and want to display your logo, please do so. It also helps us because one question we often get asked is, oh, who's using Q? And it's always easier to just show this page and say, oh, there's a long list of users. I know already the list is way longer, but it's nice to have something we can publicly share. So that would be appreciated. If there's anything, just always, please feel free to reach out. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and to say we're also looking to work on those case studies that actually provide the detail behind those use cases as well. And for example, with apologies, there's one logo that is in the process of being added, which I won't preempt.
Next
so I'll skip that one, and then we can talk about that on the next community update. I just caught myself before I said it out loud there. I think that's it. So if anybody has any questions at this point, we can switch to those. Although thanks to those who've been asking questions along the way, and thanks to Rog, Marcel, who have clearly been answering them along the way. But if there's anything that hasn't been answered, please fire away. Cedric, please.
Hey, it's been a while.
Indeed.
One thing I've been
Hey,
thinking
Cedric.
about. Hey, I know we've been working on the module systems. Great idea, something we needed for a long time. I think one thing that there's kind of a gap in our current, I guess, in the current software tooling ecosystem is, I guess you'd call it configuration packages, where we need a way to get these whatever arbitrary configurations that are fed into applications, as well as the different versions. It's not something like a lot of people now, I'd say the simple way is to use environment variables. That has some security implications that make it not ideal. So the recommended thing to do is to use a file system, or like use a file that's loaded into the application at runtime. And then they usually mount that on a Kubernetes volume, but then also like the Kubernetes secrets itself is not necessarily actually secret, so it can be awkward. I know the closest thing that I can think of that actually works is how I'm saying is Crossplane has a concept of configuration packages, and it also uses those OCI container images as the kind of delivery mechanism. And so this would be kind of something similar to the module, like it's still using the OCI container as a format, but I guess it'd be a different cadence, because when you're publishing a module for public consumption, that's kind of at a slower pace. You're trying to be careful of the changes. This is something that's tightly tied to a specific application, and you'd be like maybe even deploy multiple configuration versions per application version, depending, because you might want to change that faster, right? Yeah, and then dealing with all the secrets and stuff, I think there's a gap right now that could be useful for Q, but we already done the work to do the module system, and we could probably leverage that same infrastructure. It'd just be kind of a different modality, if that makes sense. So that might be an interesting thing to explore. I'd have to think about it a little more on the implications. So that's one thing. Another thing is I've been playing around with a lot of the different AI tools. It's a very rapidly changing environment. I'd say right now the best one is Claude Code with the Claude 4 models. It's actually pretty incredible. I've been using, like, I got the max version of everything on all like the OpenAI stuff and like that. So it's pretty incredible right now. It's been thinking about, like, when you think about how we use configuration and what we're trying to do with Q is, when we want these libraries, we want well-structured schemas for things. And then there's like the last mile where the developer per application, per whatever thing you want to configure, they do the work. But I feel like AI is very good at this, just generation in general, but also just like figuring out the structure of an application. Like you can now create tasks for it to, hey, look at this application and create the configuration that will wire stuff together. It's actually really good at that. And so I still think there's still use for, of course, the schemas and stuff. There might be some use cases where instead of configuring things in a separate language, it might be just faster to generate it inside the application code, because you can rapidly just ask the AI to like change it on demand. But there's still, I think, the need for, again, versioning of specific configurations and dynamically reloading it, as well as secrets, or gluing between different components in complex systems. Data-intensive applications, that's not going to go away. So I think finding those synergies and where we can leverage that to create demand, because again, like both these things, configuration packages as well as making it ideal for AI use cases, would I think drive a lot of adoption for Q, which is why I'm bringing them. So that's just two things.
Thanks, Ed. That's absolutely wonderful. Thank you. I'll allow others to chip in if they like, or indeed we could sort of certainly follow up afterwards. I'll tackle those in reverse if you don't mind. Honestly, I think the extent to which in places I personally, but sort of I know others are using AI LLMs on a daily basis is just increasing. That's super clear as like a supporting tool from my perspective in many ways. The way that so I think there's like a huge space to explore there. But the way that I conceptualize things with respect to Q and this space is that, there's a number of things when none of these AI tools are going to be perfect. But what's great is that if actually they're generating, say, some Q, and then I can confirm that generated Q as essentially facts, and confirm that as a human, and then use those facts as the basis for further stuff to happen. That's great, because then you've got some sort of cycle going on there. Yes, where there's generation going on, but it's based on facts that I as a human, and guess what, Q validation can actually confirm to be true, or at least valid according to the statement of those facts. I was just going to say, I think Nick and others are doing a huge amount in this space. So I would definitely encourage folks to sort of, if they're interested in doing so and willing to share on things like Slack, Discord, set up other sessions, right? Because I hate to think we're never going to fit in the remaining 12 minutes on this session, the huge amount that I know others are spending on this space here. Briefly, to just talk about the first point that you mentioned, Cedric, regarding the, I think you call them configuration
Packages.
Packages, thank you. That was the phrase I was after. Honestly, that's perfect feedback. And I think it fits squarely within that call to action that I had earlier on the deployment patterns piece.
Right.
That configuration packages thing, whether they are bundled as OCI or, as I said, you actually have some source that is even a database which is receiving, many updates potentially per second. I think you sort of kind of hit the nail on the head there. Is that there could be a plethora of different sources that end up sort of feeding into some evaluation. And that that just changing over time, and so please do, if you've got specific thoughts or ideas in that space, let's pick up that conversation in what we're going to call the deployment pattern space, because I think it's just useful to think about how in my head I would consider such a thing being like a different source for such a system, just as like a GitHub repo would be a different source, just as like an SQL database with some sort of time-based trigger or whatever would be
Managing the life cycle, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
One thing
please,
before I hand it off. The reason I originally know about this, and I remember, is reading the Google SRE book, and they talked about, like, in one example, they brought up the concept of a configuration package for like some example they're bringing, and at that time, and this was like years ago, I was like, oh, that's actually kind of obvious, So myself, if you have any remembrance of that, like, I'm pretty sure it's pretty standard in Google to have configuration packages built by Blaze as part of, like, and that's kind of like version separately, application versions.
There's multiple ways to do this. You can also have a more dynamic sort of updating of configuration. So there's multiple configuration delivery systems that we've been thinking about, some of those at least. So maybe it's good to take this offline indeed, and have a more in-depth discussion, because there's many ways.
I will say there's a gap right now in our current open source tooling. I don't think there's equivalent, so it could be something.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just to briefly follow up on that point in terms of the gap in the open source tooling piece, just coming back to a point I made earlier on as to some of these things we will solve at a language level, some at a tooling level, some potentially actually require us to have some sort of actually running service or whatever somewhere that facilitates these things, because actually it's not just a one-shot thing. It is this thing is a long-running process in some way, shape, or form. So I think it's just trying to work out what the building blocks are in each of these places, sort of saying, okay, yep, this kind of fits for all these different use cases that we've got in mind. Make sure, are we solving all the problems that people have here, particularly those human coordination problems, which are just very real in this space, and also things like security, sensitivities, etc. Right, there's quite a lot that needs to be fitted into this, but Joshua Gilman pulled together a really good example that sort of started this kickstarted the deployment patterns session back in February. So I look forward to actually re-engaging and on that side of things, and hopefully sharing more of this stuff to encourage others to do the same as well and really generate a whole load of ideas here. Sorry, Steve.
Just want to say, mention some prior art. The Flux project, recently, as probably 3.5 years ago, started using OCI artifacts to do what it's kind of like git list git offs. So instead of reading git repositories to find the Kubernetes manifests that it was to apply in the cluster, they allowed you to publish OCI artifacts instead. And so it's very much overlapping with what I think Cedric was talking about earlier with publishing configuration packages. In that case, if you consider the manifests are nothing but configuration, I was using that. It was working well. Q was earlier in the process, so I used Q to generate the YAML and JSON that went into those OCI artifacts, and was kind of done exporting and validating by the time it got published. But just then turns into an artifact management problem. Like, how do you keep too many of them from piling up in the registry and things like that?
Mhm.
So
Yeah, I've heard of GitOps before. I think I didn't know the specifics on how they generate that into an artifact and then manage all the versions and map them to application versions if you need to switch it dynamically. I think that's where the complexity is.
Awesome, Steve. Thanks for the reminder on that. Yes, Stefan, who wrote Flux, also wrote Timoni, and Timoni is a friend of Q, and Q is a friend of Timoni. So yeah, I think there's with specific patterns or specific modes or systems that exist already, I absolutely think we can learn from those. And indeed, you can, as you do as you suggest, Steve, and actually use Q to drive or sort of act as glue between parts of that system. That's absolutely clear. I think the key thing, Roger's hinted at one thing there, and the other thing that I was going to say is one of the key things to my mind is from a Q perspective, this whole concept of having configurations or values that are incomplete, that are later supplemented by values in a very principled way. And also this concept of allowing teams to coordinate at a language level. That's something that fundamentally is something that Q supports, and again via especially the concept of defaults, but also incomplete values as well. So it's just making sure that when we're thinking about things from a Q perspective, especially the language level, but also the primitives on top, that actually we're learning from things like Flux and other systems in terms of what works well, but also what doesn't work quite so well. For example, where you haven't got good opportunities for coordination or conflict resolution between teams. And so it's making sure we've got those examples, either specifically from things like Flux or just sort of slightly more abstractly. We need to coordinate between these three teams here on getting this configuration here. This team has priority, etc. We're happy with specific examples as well as abstract. This is how we think we want to do it type things, and then trying to map that to that space. So yeah, I definitely think we can learn from Flux, but I don't mean to sort of shorten the list to just Flux. We can learn from any system. So again, if people have good experience of other systems, absolutely please include that in those experience reports as well. Okay, great. In which case, please, Steve, again, yeah.
sorry, I got hit.
No, don't.
You may be able to tell from that massive thread that I was driving in Slack a couple of weeks ago. I have renewed interest in kind of air-gapped use of modules. So you could also say that it's kind of like the vendoring problem. But the Q tool is very clever right now to kind of late on demand. It will fetch modules and cache them. And it's really nice that it does that. It doesn't force you to think ahead of time about how to use modules and steps to start consuming them. But my particular interest, and maybe Eugen on the call might also be interested, is in Bazel. And Bazel's model kind of splits things in time so that by the time the Q tool runs to use modules, I need to think about it as kind of being air-gapped in the sense that I'd prefer that it not rely on network at that point and be able to find all the module related files in a particular place. So I almost have all that I need, but we've got a little bit of a tooling gap that we have some open issues addressing. There's the idea, I think, of QMod download is one of the proposed subplans. Yeah. So I just want to say I'm still interested. I don't know if you're looking for external help on that. If anyone else has any other use scenarios that they want to discuss, but that's my motivation to do that.
That's kind. Roger, I don't know whether you want to say anything in particular there. We also have QMod vendor as well.
Both of those are on the roadmap. There's a bit. I mean, I suppose the main thing is just finalizing what we want the design to look like in terms of what those command line. Because a basic version is really easy, but do we want it to actually look like that? Do we want to commit to that? Basic design. Yeah,
Steve, I think it would be good on either QMod download or especially QMod vendor, if you've got any specific requirements from your side, just chuck them in there, because I think honestly it's an open source project that is based on top of Q, also wants QMod vendor as well, and their use case might be slightly different from what you need for Bazel, as it were. So please get the Bazel requirements in there, noting our exchange on the embed side of things, where from a Symlink perspective, that you're coming at it from a specific set of constraints, for want of a better phrase, on the Bazel side of things. So please do actually chuck that in there. The whole thing, again, just to briefly mention it, about the air-gapped requirements more generally. Again, this was like a key consideration in using the OCI model. So whether for Bazel or a truly air-gapped, say, for example, like sensitive, for whatever reason, military, whatever you might consider it, scenario, or just I've unplugged my computer from the network scenario, is to be able to do this air-gapped approach. And so the fact that we have OCI artifacts is a key part of that, from just being able to mirror OCI artifacts between different servers which support that air-gappedness, or as you said, literally just using local caches, whether it be a visible vendor or a hidden, I've downloaded everything to the cache. Again, so that's kind of where I'm trying to nudge you. If you want to see the vendor, then it's QMod vendor. If you want to sort of just pull things out of the cache, it's going to be QMod download, and then they're subtly different. So if you can chime in on what you want and what you need, we've had, if you like, slightly more votes for QMod vendor on the basis that people actually want to see the vendor, as it were, in some way, shape, or form. But you can absolutely achieve what you want already today by doing a bit of hackery and do like a poor man's QMod download into an empty Q cache dir. But at the same time, it's more kind of what do you need, and make sure that, as Rog said, then we get the UI UX piece of that right from the command line. That would be great.
Okay, let's do this.
In which case, we're at time. If thanks everybody for joining. Please do just ping us offline or just in Slack or Discord if there's anything that we've missed and you'd like to see covered next time. Otherwise, we'll post the recording and the slides and transcript as soon as they're done.